Thank you very much for the invitation to come along to this. I always enjoy coming here, so thank you for that. Whether you enjoy me coming here is an entirely different issue, but hopefully we'll do all right. So I think I am introducing, at least I hope I'm introducing, because that's what I'm doing, whether it's, I'm introducing a book called Daniel, which you're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. I apologise now for Nikki and Tim, because you've already listened to this 2 weeks ago at the Community Church. But Daniel is an amazing book. And when you read it, this is an introduction, so I think the title is Daniel the Wise. But if you know me, you'll know that that's not what I'm going to be talking about. It's just an introduction to Daniel, really. I will mention wisdom, so when I do that, you can applaud if you like, because that would be the hint that I'm actually doing what I'm meant to do. But by and large, I'm not talking about wisdom, I'm just talking about Daniel and the story of the first chapter. So when you read Daniel, it clearly splits into two stylistically different halves of about equal length. So next slide, please. Chapters 1 to 6 are stories involving Daniel and his three colleagues, and those are the bits of Daniel that are famous. So the lion's den and the fiery furnace and things like that. Chapters 7 to 12, so the second half, contain 4 dreams of Daniel and lots of really weird apocalyptic and prophetic stuff about geopolitics, plus all sorts of weird stuff. I don't know who will be explaining all that later in this series, but good luck to them, because it's not easy. But Daniel doesn't just split stylistically, it also splits linguistically, because it was written in 2 different languages, Aramaic and Hebrew. Now, given what I've just said about Daniel being in 2 halves, you might think that one half of Daniel is in one language and the other half is in the other. And whilst that is a logical thought process, it is also wrong. So chapter 1 is written in Hebrew, chapters 2 to 7 are in Aramaic, and then it ends in Hebrew again. So the fact that chapters 2 through to 7 were written entirely in Aramaic suggests that it is meant to be read as a whole. So next slide, please. And this is further confirmed by the fact that chapters 2 to 7 have a very distinct structure, which is repeated throughout the Bible in lots of different places, particularly in the Old Testament, and it's called a chiastic structure. So if you're poetry, it's like A, B, C, C, B, A. So in chapter 2, we have Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and it's interpreted by Daniel. In chapter 7, at the far other end, we have Daniel has a dream that is similar to Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, and that is interpreted. So we have dreams at either end. Then in chapters 3 and 6, we have Daniel's friends refuse to worship an idol, and they are thrown into a fiery furnace. And in chapter 6, Daniel refuses to worship the king, and he's thrown into the lion's den. 2 very similar stories. And in the middle, we have 2 stories about the top dogs in Babylon. So we have Nebuchadnezzar. His pride is highlighted by supernatural means, which leads to his downfall. And then we have Belshazzar's pride, which is highlighted by supernatural means, leading to his downfall. So we have a very structured, organised section within Daniel. And then that leads on eventually to the remaining dreams of Daniel that complete the book. Now, chapter 1 that we're going to be talking about today is an introduction to all of that. So it's the introduction to the book of Daniel. Whether we get a grasp of that by the end of this, only you will know when we get there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the whole chapter, but do a little bit of narrative whilst we read the story, because it is a story, and it's a story which we are invited to get involved with. So the next slide, please. So this is how it begins. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. Now these he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Now, this paragraph sounds very simple, but actually it compresses quite a lot of history and makes it sound as though it all happened at the same time. However, we learn in 2 Kings that actually this period was a much longer period, and the timelines are not easy to match up. However, in general, there is some evidence that Judah became a vassal state. They were controlled. They're not necessarily invaded, but they sort of became, a state that had to pay money to Babylon in order to stay safe. That happened around 604 BC. That's the period we're talking about. And we know that Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem in 598, 597 BC, and then destroyed it in 586 BC. So this is the sort of period that we're talking about. This is the period when Daniel and his friends were taken to Babylon. And just in case you don't know that the map, obviously, Judah is modern day Israel, Babylon is modern day Iraq. So kind of over that sort of way. So, the other side of a big desert. So for the sake of argument, let's say that they were taken to Babylon in 597 BC, and at the time they were aged around 20. Right, so have them in mind, 20-year-olds. Let's get back to Daniel. So next slide, please. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Now, this was the equivalent of our modern university education followed by civil service training. It was absolutely the best training you could get anywhere in the world at that time. And the brightest and the best were taken from the elites of the Israelite community, and they were trained to become the administrators and civil servants of the Babylonian kingdom. Next slide. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So we know from the previous passage that these 4 men were from the royal family and the nobility, and they were young, handsome, and intelligent. If one translates that into our society today, they would be boys from a posh public school. Imagine them as 4 Benedict Cumberbatches or David Camerons. That may put you off them, or it may not. I don't know. Now, next slide, please. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Now, the aim of this renaming was to strip them from their roots. Their original names all included the name of God. So IAH on the end of a name is Yahweh, and EL is El Shaddai, El is God. So all of their names had the name of God part of it, but those names were stripped away from them and they were given Babylonian names. But their name was not the only thing that was stripped from them. In the translation I've just read, which is the New International Version, Ashpenaz, the man who renamed Daniel and his friends, is described as the chief of the court officials. However, the Hebrew word for that role can be interpreted very differently indeed. And indeed, in many translations of the Bible, so King James, Revised, all of that, many translations of the Bible, his role is described as being the chief of the eunuchs, or indeed the chief eunuch. Alas, dear friends, it is quite possible that Daniel and his companions had become eunuchs. And this would be consistent with the fact that the book of Daniel does not refer to any of them having wives or children. And there's also a couple of sections in Isaiah which are consistent with that. Now Deuteronomy 23, going back to the law of Israel, said that a eunuch must be excluded from the assembly of the Lord. As such, it was a big thing. If Daniel was a eunuch, he was defiled under the terms of the law. Next slide, please. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself further, you could say, with the royal food and the wine. and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now, Daniel, he was an enslaved person. He had no control over what had happened to him physically. However, he did potentially have some control over what he ate, and he exerted that control as best he could. He therefore resolved not to eat the rich and lavish palace food. Now, in many commentaries, it is assumed that he made that decision because the food would not have complied with the Jewish food laws. But it doesn't actually say that. And I wonder, and this is speculation on my part, whether it was as much about him asserting his self and his own identity on a situation where his self had been systematically destroyed. So he'd been taken from his country, his name had been changed, and he had been physically emasculated. Now, and in that situation, he wanted to do the one thing that would allow him to both assert his humanity and remind himself that he was a child of God. Next slide, please. Now, God had caused the official to show favour and sympathy to Daniel. Daniel's a nice bloke, in other words, very helpful, worked alongside his boss. But the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, Nebuchadnezzar, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food. And treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and gave them vegetables instead. Now, I know what you're thinking. What vegetables would they have eaten back then in the Babylonian times? Well, I can tell you that because this was obviously long before potatoes and tomatoes or maize had made their ways from the Americas to Eurasia. So no potatoes, no tomatoes. But what they did have was, so imagine a whole diet like this. So it's wheat, rye, barley, lentils, chickpeas, fava beans and peas, lettuce, leeks and watercress. And onions, garlic, radishes, and so that's actually not bad. There was a lot of vegetables available back then. And if they were allowed fruit as well, and I suspect they were, they could have dates, figs, pomegranates, olives, grapes, and melons. So basically, Waitrose effectively is what they had. So next slide, please. Very, very high. It's a good diet, which is why they look good after 10 days. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And I love that literature bit. So, they were the equivalent of, they knew their Jane Austen and their Dickens and their George Eliot, or the equivalent thereof. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar, a nervous moment. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. They had a job interview, and they passed it with flying colours. They became civil servants. And next slide, please. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Now, this reference to magicians and enchanters is just a reminder that Daniel and his companions were now in a very alien world than that they had grown up in. Chapter 1 then ends with a sentence that does this weird thing that the Bible does occasionally, which is it compresses time as though time doesn't actually matter. And it says this, "And Daniel remained there until the first year of Cyrus." Now, this sentence just sounds so simple, but to understand it, one has to understand a little bit of Babylonian history. And on one level, I apologise for this, but I'm a nerd and I love doing this sort of thing. So a little bit about, next slide please, a little bit about Babylonian kings. So the king of Babylon that we have just been discussing is a guy called Nebuchadnezzar. He was, in fact, if we're being precise, Nebuchadnezzar II. And he ruled from 605 to 562 BC. He was succeeded by Amel-Marduk, who's also mentioned in the Bible somewhere, Kings, I think, and then Neriglissar. And then a guy called Labashi-Marduk, who only survived for 2 months. He was the Liz Truss of Babylonian kings. And finally, Nabonidus. But the king we have just read, so the sentence we have just read was, and Daniel remained there until the first year of none of them, but Cyrus. And that was in 539 BC, and that was when Babylon fell to the Persian king Cyrus II, also known as Cyrus the Great. So in one sentence, we have spanned 60 years, and Daniel suddenly becomes 80, having been 20 at the beginning of the sentence. So in one sentence, we learn that Daniel served numerous Babylonian kings and survived several palace coups and changes in administration, which suggests that he was extraordinarily politically astute. He kept on the right side of everyone. He was a wise man. Wise, you see, put that in. And that, dear friends, is the end of chapter 1. That's where it ends. So next slide, please. So there we have it. What can we learn from this introduction to the story? Now, I think there is a danger in trying to lift universal truths from what is ultimately a story. The story is not, for example, saying that we should all become vegans. Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. But that is not what the story is about. So what do we think the story is about? Well, one of the beauties of stories is that it'll mean something different to you than it does to me. That's the nature of stories. We respond to different people within a story, and different themes and different elements and different plots, elements of the story. But this is what it means to me, and you can take it or leave it, because my analysis isn't right and your one isn't wrong. But you can just listen to this and think, does that resonate or does it not? It is the story of 4 young men who are uprooted from one country and placed against their will in another. Now, the immediate reaction is to think, oh, how awful for them. Poor them. Kind of particularly when you factor in the whole eunuch thing, which probably wasn't on their plan as they were growing up. But another way of looking at it is that they were being given the opportunity of a lifetime. They were being recruited to join the civil service of the most powerful empire the world had ever known, and to have direct access to Nebuchadnezzar, its king. And it involved an all-expenses-paid education, no student debt, and it was of unparalleled quality. It was the sort of opportunity nowadays that many young people would absolutely fight for. Accordingly, we shouldn't leap to the assumption that this was an awful development in the lives of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. On the contrary, as 20-year-olds, they may have been excited by the prospect of living in Babylon, the greatest city on earth. Now, in that respect, the story of Daniel can be read as a story of kids leaving home, going to university, or starting their first job. Beyond that, it is the story of all of us as we experience something new. It could be about getting married or having children or moving into retirement or moving cities. Any change that we experience, it's about change in how we deal with it. How do we assert our humanity and our spirituality and our relationship with God in a world over which we sometimes feel we have no control? And I think that Daniel is saying that when we have these moments, when our life changes direction, it may be illness, it could be redundancy, it could be all sorts of things. There will be things over which we have no control, but there will also be things where we do have control. And it's in those areas where we can make small decisions that honour God. Now, Daniel had no control over where he lived. He had no control over his body. He had no choice about his career. But he did have control over what he ate and how he thought and what he said and how he reacted to people. This weekend, I'm a partner in a law firm, and this weekend was our partnership conference. So I went to bed at 2 a.m. this morning and had to drive back from Berkshire this morning, hence missing Dave, who was speaking at the community church this morning. And I made a decision many years ago that, people drink a lot of these sorts of things. And I made a decision that I just wasn't going to do that. Sobriety and soberness was, that's just a little decision to honour God. It was also a very easy decision because that's, I don't drink very much. Other decisions, I decided many years ago to go part-time. Why? Because I wanted an element of control over, I didn't want to be controlled by my employer, if that makes sense. I wanted to make a decision that, in a small way, honoured God. And I think, there are many other small decisions that I have made throughout my career that have tried to keep me on the straight and narrow and, reminding me, keeping my focus on God rather than me and my career. And I think that was why, or is similar to, why Daniel decided to eat vegetables. It was something he needed to do at the time as a way of reminding himself that he was God's. Despite all of his circumstances, he was God's. And that phrase, at the time, is important. It was a decision he made at the time. Because we learn in chapter 10 that later he started eating the choice food and the drink. So later he changed his mind. It was at that time, it was a different decision he had to make. But at the time when he was 20, he knew that he had to make one decision to eat vegetables because he was honouring God. And there are two other stories in the book of Daniel where Daniel and his friends make small, faithful decisions, albeit ones with large consequences. In chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego refuse to bow down to an idol, and as a result, they're thrown in the fiery furnace. In chapter 6, Daniel continues to pray to his God, and as a result, he's thrown into the lion's den. And for me, the book of Daniel, or at least the first half of the book of Daniel, is all about the power of these small, faithful decisions that we all make to honour God. This isn't about changing the world. At no point does Daniel say to the other civil servants, you should all be vegans, And at no point does Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego say, you shouldn't bow down to an idol. This was about their own decisions and about asserting their own humanity and their own love of God in a strange situation. This is a book about the small decisions that these young men take to remind themselves that despite everything that has happened to them, they are God's. And the book is about the way that God honours these small decisions, sometimes in spectacular ways. And we here all constantly need to make these small decisions. Sometimes it may be to pray, to make time to pray. Sometimes it may be to make time to fast. This year I have been reading through the Old Testament and then writing a blog about each book of the Bible as I read it. It's just a small decision to remind myself that I am God, that there's something more important than the other things that fill our lives. I'm also headed towards retirement, and I'm currently thinking about the small decisions that I need to make to ensure that I keep my focus on serving God and loving others, that I don't just give up and do nothing but photograph moths, which I do actually quite like doing. So small decisions made with wisdom, I think, are key to the Christian life. There is so much in life, particularly with the way that the world news is at the moment. There is so much in life over which we have no control. But we can make small decisions that honour God and remind us that we are his children and are loved.